Thank you for joining us for this event on how the 2000 election set the stage for 2026. Our editorial director, Jessica Husman, will moderate a panel about the recount that changed everything. The crisis in Florida in 2000 led to the creation of the Help America Vote Act, the modernization of voter rolls, the birth of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and a lasting debate over the role the federal governments and courts should play in elections. 25 years later, the questions first raised in 2000 still define our politics, and it continues to shape the controversies, reforms, and battles of today. To keep up with our reporting, please subscribe to our newsletters at votebeat.org/newsletters. Also, we're a nonprofit newsroom, and our journalism relies on support from our readers. Please support our work and events like this one as you're able by giving any amount at votebeat.org/donate. Jessica will be joined today by election law expert Rick Hasen and Okaloosa County, Florida election supervisor Paul Lux. Rick Hasen is the Gary T. Schwartz Endowed Chair in Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA School of Law. He is an internationally recognized expert in election law, writing as well in the areas of legislation and statutory interpretation, remedies, and torts. He is co-author of leading casebooks in election law and remedies. Paul Lux is currently the elected supervisor of elections for Okaloosa County, Florida. He served as the information systems coordinator for the county during the 2000 election. He has served in Okaloosa County's elections for 25 years. He has also served as an officer of the Florida Supervisors of Elections, starting as treasurer in 2014 and serving as president during the 2018 elections. He currently represents Florida's local election officials on the EAC Standards Board. Thank you both very much for being here with us today for this. If you're listening and want to submit questions during the event, please do so by using the Q&A button. I'm going to turn this over to Jessica so we can dive in.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for what I believe is Votebeat's nerdiest event so far. I am delighted. I have been obsessed with the 2000 election since it was 2000, and I will date myself. I was 10, and don't look at me like that, Paul. And I jumped out of my bunk bed and I asked my mom who was president, and she said, "We don't know." And it blew my mind. So I am excited to blow all of your minds today because I think you will realize that you can't really understand what is going on in 2026 until you understand what happened in Florida with, a variety of gentlemen in khakis maybe storming a building and some butterfly ballots and some caterpillar ballots, which I just found out about. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rick, for being here. I would like to do a couple of things really quickly. So, Rick, I would love for you to give us sort of a really short summary of what, and I know this is a big question, what happened in 2000 and sort of why it remains something that we're still talking about today. And then we're going to very quickly have Paul take us into a new part of his office, and he's actually going to show us one of the voting machines from Palm Beach County in 2000 so that you can see how it worked and why people were making the mistakes that they made and have a little bit of context for the issues that we'll discuss today. So Rick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me today. This topic I never tire of talking about. So the 2000 election was very close in the Electoral College, which is the only vote that matters for choosing the president. It all came down to who won Florida. When the votes totals came in Florida, there was about a just under 2,000, maybe it was close, 1,600 vote margin between the parties, with Bush ahead. And over the course of the next 36 days, there was both administrative recounts and protests and contests, as well as litigation. There was a lot of litigation over the various ways that counties were dealing with disputed ballots. There were disputes over how ballots should be recounted. This is a punch card ballot, and for various reasons that we can talk about, it was very hard for some people to punch out the little piece of paper or Chad. And so each hole represented a vote for a particular candidate. And so people were looking at these pieces of paper and they were trying to figure out whether a hole punch was a punch for Gore or for Bush or for no one that could be determined. And what we learned was that the state didn't have a uniform standard. Counties didn't even have some standards for these things. And counties were administering their elections with partisan election boards. They were taking direction from a partisan Secretary of State. They were also hearing contrary direction from a partisan Attorney General who was from the other party. And all of these disputes ended up after there had been a bunch of recounts and some litigation. There was just over 500 votes between Bush and Gore when the Florida Supreme Court said that there would be a statewide recount of all of the ballots that did not record a vote for president, all the undervotes, where the ballot didn't record a vote for Bush or Gore or for any of the other candidates. Goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stopped that counting almost immediately. It said this is going to cast a cloud over the legitimacy of the election if we count first. A few days later, on a kind of rocket docket that we don't see from the Supreme Court really under any circumstances, the court got briefs, heard oral argument, and issued a decision. And the decision said that the way the recount was conducted violated the Constitution. And because the time was basically ticking in terms of when states had to get their electoral college votes in, time was up. There was no chance to do a recount under some kind of constitutional conditions. And so in the end, right after the Supreme Court ruled, Al Gore, who was behind by a little over 500 votes, he conceded the election. He said he disagreed with the Supreme Court, but he respected the decision, and George W. Bush became the president. I should say that because of Florida sunshine laws, all of the ballots were public records. They were sent to a research center in Illinois. They did a recount of the ballots, and they determined that if they had just done the counting the undervotes, Gore still would have lost. But if they would have counted all the ballots, including the overvotes, where people had initially recorded votes for maybe two candidates, that Gore could have won. And that's because some people punched a hole for Gore and then wrote Gore's name in, which was recorded by the machine as an overvote. And so today, we don't have punch card machines, but what we have is a lot more litigation. Election litigation exploded, going from, in my count, just under about 100 cases nationally a year to we're now about 300 cases a year. And that's a huge change.
It's a huge sea change, yes. And it's been a fascinating thing to cover for the last couple of years. And I want to talk about all of that. But first, I want to see this voting machine, Paul. Do you think you could flick your iPad? Well, first, tell everybody what you were doing in the year 2000 in your county.
So I will say that as I'm going to show you with when we look at the ballot itself, yes, there were 10 presidential candidates on that ballot plus room for a write-in. So 11 spaces on the ballot, which is enormous for a race like president. Here in Florida, there were 7 different ways for voters to vote in that election. So there were counties that were still hand counting paper ballots, right? Put an X in the box next to the person you want, fold it up, stick it in a box, we'll count it later. There were 2 different types of lever machines still in operation in Florida, 2 different types of punch card systems, the one we are all now most familiar with because of the butterfly ballot, and 2 different types of optical scan systems that were being used. So when that recount was called, it meant different things to different people. Because how do you recount a lever machine? Well, you get your notebook out and you write the numbers back down again and you add them up again and you go, yep, it's the same number. So that's a recount when you do lever machines. So there was no standard for what recount meant. And in fact, the statute at the time simply said, each canvassing board responsible for conducting a recount shall examine the counters on the machines or the tabulation of the ballots in each precinct in which the office appeared and determine whether the returns correctly reflect the votes cast. And that was our law. Nowhere did it say, what if it's still close after we've done whatever it is we think a recount is? And that was probably the big crux of the whole point behind Bush v. Gore was wait a minute, what if it's still close and we haven't actually, a lot of people haven't recounted things? The other factor that a lot of people overlook is the fact that Florida does indeed have two time zones, and I am indeed in what we like to affectionately call God's time zone, which is Central Time. Me and 15 other counties here in Central Time, and so when the media reported that at 7 p.m. Eastern that all the polls in Florida were closed and they had called the state for Al Gore, we were all still voting for another hour over here. And we were a little surprised to hear on the news that we were closed. But as Rick said, election night, the day after, Bush was leading by 1,700 votes. But then the recount happened, and the big argument was, what do we do when things are really still close? So when we went to bed that night, we didn't know who had won either, because of course, took longer to count vote by mail ballots back then too, or to even get the reports for vote by mails in. I will note for the record too that at that time Florida's vote by mail required you to be absent or to have an excuse. We were not using no excuse vote by mail at the time, so you actually had to be absent in order to vote by mail in that election as well. So certainly not the plethora of people voting by mail for with no excuse voting that we have now.
Perfect.
But let me get over to my iPad and I will show you all and have a quick chat through voting on this fabulous punch card machine, if you will.
It's an amazing system. And I think while we're waiting for Paul to open that up, when he casts his iPad upon this beautiful voting machine, I want you to take note of the instructions on it, and how it differs from the experience that you probably have, which is casting a ballot on a ballot marking device or on a piece of paper directly, right? There are a lot of steps here. And so it makes sense to me that voters may not have followed all of them and that things got lost in the process. So Paul, there it is.
All right. So you're looking at the voting booth as the voter would have seen it. I'll also note for you that fun idea here that there is a time limit. You can be in the voting booth, only 5 minutes at that time. I'm going to move this a little closer so that we can actually see. So you'll know that the instructions tell you how to insert the card into that slot. Make sure that these two empty holes go over the two little red tabs right there. But those instructions not only tell you all of that, but they also tell you to be sure and look at the back partially punched, and they call them chips, not chads, on the instructions here. And then making sure that you've punched all the holes, and then you're ready to go. Down here in the voting booth itself, and I'm going to tip this iPad up a bit so you guys can see the ballot. So here you have the here you have the ballot, and again, the instructions about inserting your ballot are there. It tells you to vote all pages after removing and what to do. But when you flip this first page over, so notice presidential candidates, you flip this first page over, there's the butterfly ballot. So as you're going to see when Rick shows us the caterpillar ballot, in order to put all of it on one page, they alternate candidates by ovals up and down, up and down, up and down across as they go through. So you will take your ballot, you're going to insert it in here. You're going to push it all the way down until it latches on those little red things. That opens these holes for voting. You're going to pick up the handy little tool, and you're going to punch for your choice of candidate. And you literally, let's go with the Constitution Party tonight. And boom, it's as simple as that. You poke your hole. When you're done voting, you turn that page to continue. You'll notice what it's doing is it's jumping columns on that card as it goes along. And so it's changing what column you're voting in as you go through things. And you can just punch your way through. And then when you're all done.
Fascinating.
So you're all done voting. Of course, you can review it as much as you want, but you really can't see what you've punched out. And the fact that it has the numbers here probably doesn't mean a lot to people. But when you're done, you pull that card out. And there you can see illustrated in the light that I actually cleanly punched my chads out. I look on the back like the instructions tell me. I don't have any hanging, swinging, dimpled, or any other kind of chad on there. Then over here is the ballot box. Oops, I'm not going to be able to, let me just move it this way. Then you literally take this ballot and you fold it up. Yeah, there we go. And you just drop it in the box. And that was voting.
And that was
in Palm
voting.
Beach County.
That
That was voting.
And you had
And
5
then
minutes to do it.
And you had 5 minutes. Now, all those boxes, seals and double checks and who's got the keys, et cetera, all of that stuff gets taken to a central location where they get emptied. They have to detach those stubs from the actual cards, and then they put them through a big machine that has little magnetic fingers that reads as it goes through. The interesting part about these ballots, if I could get, I'm going to pick up another one to show you, is they are pre-perforated. You can kind of see on the back. Maybe if I tip it a little bit, I can't tell whether you can see that or not. So these holes are pre-perforated. So the more you handle the cards, the more you put them in piles and mangle them and do this and do that, these other chads can fall out, and there's no way to stop that. And so handling these cards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Every time you handle it, there's a likelihood that more chads could fall out. There's a chance if you didn't follow the instructions and remove any swinging, hanging chads off the back, that when the card goes in the reader, it could fold that thing back over the hole when the little magnetic finger's looking for a vote and it doesn't see the vote because it folded that little thing back over the window where the hole was supposed to be. So a lot of things that can go wrong with this type of system as it relates to how voting was done in Palm Beach County at the time.
Thank you, Paul. All right. Well, we would like to see your face again. So if you want to go back to your computer.
I'm gonna close this window entirely so that it's not still on.
Great.
And I will.
And while you get back in that direction, I'll lay out what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about 3 ways that this election, in the way that it was just administered before you, impacts our policy today. So we'll start with our policies, our procedures, the way that we vote, right? So we're going to talk about our policies. We'll talk about the laws that came out of 2000 and their continued impact on today. We'll also talk about voting technology, which changed dramatically after that election for all of the reasons that you might infer from that. And then also we'll talk about sort of the prevailing misinformation and threads about voter fraud that really carried forth out of that election and have made this the new normal in American politics. So let's start with the policies. So Rick, why don't you talk to us? I think probably, and I'm happy for you to disagree with me, the big one is the Help America Vote Act. So why don't you talk about sort of the origin of that and sort of its outlines in American democracy?
Sure. And let me just say one more thing or two about the punch card machines.
Yes. Okay.
So it was true that Palm Beach County had this butterfly ballot where the names were on both sides of the booklet pointing towards the center, and it was very easy for people to try to vote for Al Gore but end up voting for Pat Buchanan, who was a third-party candidate. And one might ask, was this some kind of nefarious plot to disenfranchise voters? Well, it turns out the person who was administering those elections, her name was Teresa Lepore. She was a Democrat. She knew she had a lot of elderly voters in Palm Beach County, and she wanted to make the ballot bigger, the font, because if you've got 10 candidates in a write-in, how can you fit them all? So she put them on both sides so she could make it bigger. And so it was actually intended to help the voters, and it actually hurt them. You mentioned the Caterpillar ballot. Let me quickly talk about that because
Yes.
So Palm Beach County is the only one that used the butterfly ballot, but there were many counties, especially the large counties, that used the punch card machines. Another example of this was in Duval County. Duval County was administered by a Republican rather than a Democrat. When they printed the sample ballot in the newspaper, it showed all 11 candidates in one spot, and the instructions said, vote every page. And then when people showed up to vote, let me see if I can just briefly share this image. Are you seeing that image there?
Yes.
So when people showed up to vote, it turned out that the candidates were spread over 2 pages. So you see here, there's only 5 listed here. And you see it says, if you look to the right of that, turn the page to continue voting. But at the bottom, it says, turn page for continued list of candidates for president, vice president, which is in smaller font. And you turn the page and the rest of the candidates are there. And so there were 26,000 people, much more than the margin between the candidates, who overvoted. And who most of those
because they thought the instructions was asking them to vote twice on both
right.
sides.
And,
Yes.
and
Okay.
this was an area with many first-time voters. There was a large drive by the NAACP to get black voters to register, and the canvassers who were getting people to go out to vote said, "Be sure to vote every page," because they wanted the Democrats down ballot to get the votes too. So lots of problems. What we learned from Florida was that our elections were being done in a decentralized way. They were being administered part state law, part county law, part federal law, and it was a mess. Voter registration was a mess. All different kinds of things came to light far beyond what affected whether Bush or Gore won the election. And so there was a great need for election reform. These punch cards, and of course, you found me. I'm the other person in America who's got an old Florida voting machine in his office. These were state of the art in 1940, but they were still being used in 2000. So you had to get rid of these machines. And of course, counties are already overburdened. They can't afford this. They've got to decide if they buy a new fire truck, are they going to buy new voting machines? So there was an impetus in Congress to do something. And the thing that was done was, let's pass a law that will try to fix some of these problems. And one of the things it did was, this is the Help America Vote Act of 2002. It said we're going to have a pot of money for states to get rid of their old voting machines and upgrade their technology. And they created a commission, a bipartisan commission, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, called the Election Assistance Commission. The job of that commission at first was just to figure out which voting machines were good and to dole out money for states that adopted good voting machines. Now, Florida went to complete electronic voting in some counties. That created its own set of problems. These were machines that didn't produce a piece of paper. They threw those out and had to buy a third set of machines. So Help America Vote Act, first thing it did is it provided funding. And then there was a recognition that many states did not have a single database of all their registered voters. It was being kept by the counties. So it required that states produce a statewide registration list, a centralized list.
And that, I think, I'm just going to pause you for right there because I think this shocks people that we have not had centralized voter registration lists for very long. These things that are in the media because Trump wants them and states are giving them to him or not have only really existed since what, 2004, 2003, 2006?
It depends on the state, but right. It took a while for this to roll out. And this is why now we have poll voting centers where you can vote anywhere in your county. That only works if you've got a database that works to know where people are and what ballot they should get and all of this. So one thing it did was money. Another thing it did was put more power to the states over counties with this kind of centralization. Another thing it did was it said every county that's conducting voting, if somebody shows up to vote and they're not on the list, they have to be offered a provisional ballot, a chance to vote. And the state doesn't have to count it, but this is kind of a fail-safe. So if you think you're entitled to vote, you get this ballot, it's put to the side, and then later, the state can figure out if you're actually entitled to vote. Another thing it said is if you vote by mail, if you register by mail for the first time, and there's a federal form that you can use for voter registration, you've got to provide some identification, like last 4 of your social or your driver's license number, so that your identity could be somewhat verified. This was seen as compromise legislation, some of it making it easier for people to vote, like the provisional ballot, some of it making harder for people to cheat, like the requirement of providing ID if you register by mail the first time you actually show up to vote in person. And so the Help America Vote Act was probably, with the exception of a small law that passed related to military ballots in 2009, it was probably the last time we've seen bipartisan election-related legislation come out of this Congress.
And that's shocking. I mean, that was such a long time ago. And the fact I think, and that is indicative of and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the fact that we funded technology in that sort of large of a way was so long ago. A lot of states are still struggling to use the whole state of Louisiana is still using the voting machines that they purchased with their first round of Help America Vote Act dollars. So in a real sense, this has stuck with us. But I would like, Paul, for you to sort of talk about what it was like for you guys to implement the Help America Vote Act. Was it seen within Florida as a meaningful solution to the problems that came up in that election? Was it difficult to, I'm sure it was difficult to implement, but I'm wondering how it was sort of viewed in a positive or negative light.
Well, so obviously, what one of the most interesting things that happened was at our conference in January in 2001, everyone had the solution for the Florida problem, and everyone with every piece of equipment strung together with duct tape and baling wire rolled it into our conference as a vendor to say here's how we fix the problems in Florida. But I will say that Florida beat the federal government to the punch. And in 2001, Florida passed its own Election Reform Act, which did the things like outlawing punch card machines and lever machines, and basically saying that, you either need an optical scan paper ballot or the new DRE, which was all electronic and didn't produce a paper trail at that time. And it was when the central voter database came around, and Rick, as election nerd as you are, you'll probably appreciate this. So we had a state central list in Florida, but it wasn't a living, breathing database. We took an old 10-track digital tape dump from our old AS400 system once a quarter and sent it to the state for the central voter file, and that was our central voter file. So there was a list. I don't know how useful it was to anybody. I don't know what they did with the tape when I sent it to them. Eventually it came back to me so that I could write on another one and send another tape. But so the central voter database was probably one of the hardest problems for us to solve. Because there were so many counties who were relying on, I mean, there were counties, like I said, some of the ones using paper ballots, hand-counted paper ballots and lever machines that were still, you took the original registration document and you bound it into a book and you sent it to the polling place and you hand marked with an ink pen on it when Joe Smith showed up to vote. Joe Smith showed up to vote today and he signed the precinct register. He went over to the lever machine. He signed the polling list. He voted. That was voting in a lot of counties in Florida during 2000. So for them to say, you're going to have a database and your database is going to talk to our database, and everything's going to update. I love their use of the word real time, which is a fake construct designed by computer scientists to get more money out of people for no improved performance. But it was meant to be a real time database. But Florida was pretty far ahead of the game on most of the voting equipment. There were a lot of our counties like mine that were already using optical scan equipment. So for us locally in Okaloosa and most of my neighbors who were using some of the Sequoia or ES&S equipment, they were, we were already using some version of optical scan reader, so we didn't have to buy new equipment. But that also meant I didn't get a lot of money either, because they all got money for buying new equipment, and we got dregs of it for improving the equipment we already had, sort of a thing. But that central voter database was probably one of the biggest nuts to crack, because you have people who even still today in some of these small counties, and I'm not picking on my friend in Lafayette County, but it's him and one part-time person working in his office. When the phone rings, there's a 50% chance the supervisor of elections is answering the phone. He doesn't know how to manage a database. So he has a desktop looking PC that is his database for a smaller county. And some of us have racks of servers with all kinds of giant airplane noise sounding stuff going in the room. And then all of those things have to talk together. And the biggest concern we had, and a lot of people had, was, yes, if that state central list is going to be the official list, that's fine, but we need a local copy because what happens when the technology breaks and suddenly I can't see? At first they were like, oh, it'll be great. It'll just be online and you'll just use a web browser to access it and that'll be fine. And I said, okay, hold on. There's one cable that runs between Tallahassee and my county out here in the Panhandle. What happens when some idiot with a backhoe cuts through it? And then we got to figure out where it got cut. And, what if that happens on election day? What am I supposed to do to look up voters on election day? So we fought hard for having cached copies of our own data locally, so that we are not dead in the water. And then sure enough, first election over there in Northeast Florida, somebody cut a main cable and there were like 7 counties that found themselves relying on their cached copy of the database, and they all called me and thanked me for fighting so hard to make sure that they still had connectivity. But that was probably the biggest. And of course, the other counties, the reason Palm Beach sold their voting equipment, the reason Lee County sold their voting equipment was because.
And you have it now because it was on eBay, sure.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But the reason they were selling it off was to raise extra funds to buy whatever they were going to replace it with. And so some counties were early implementers of the touchscreens, like Pasco, jumped straight to all DRE voting, and some counties like
No
Palm
paper
Beach,
backup voting. Yeah,
yep,
absolutely.
and some counties like Palm Beach didn't want to jump that far ahead, and so they opted for a paper-based optical scan system down in
So
Palm Beach and
it
down in
really
those
sounds
counties.
like building the plane locally while the federal government is trying to fly it. I think one of the things, and Rick, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about this, that came out of this was the creation of the Election Assistance Commission. Can you tell our viewers what the EAC is, and perhaps what role it continues to play today or doesn't?
Sure. Let me tell you one more story about punch cards because I think this is indicative.
Okay.
So, Los Angeles County, where I live, used punch card machines too. And, that Lee County machine, when I would carry it to class, it can't move. Students have to come to it. But Chad would fall out because they weren't properly maintained. And so the reason you couldn't punch the stylus all the way through was because it was full of paper. So that was a big part of the problem. So, uh, Common Cause sued California and said, get rid of all the punch card machines. They're not recording votes. And the Secretary of State settled, and they agreed by 2004 they would get rid of the machines, which was the next general election. Well, it turns out that there was a recall election, which was not scheduled, against the governor, Gray Davis. This is when Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor. This is when we had 135 candidates on the ballot, which created its own set of problems. But there was a lawsuit on top of the original lawsuit saying, "Hey, don't use these machines in 2003 because we weren't expecting this election." And the case went all the way up to the Ninth Circuit en banc. The courts disagreed, but they said, we'll deal with the problem after the election if there's a problem. We're not going to enjoin the use of these machines. Well, here's the kicker. In Los Angeles County, there were only 4 things on the ballot. Do you want to recall the governor, yes or no? And then then replacement and 2 other initiatives. On the ballot in Los Angeles, 9% of voters who voted had no recorded vote, yes or no, on the only thing people cared about. 9%. In Oakland, in Alameda County, where they had moved to DREs, the undervote rate was 0.75. That is 0.75%. So this really matters in terms of disenfranchisement. And so the most important thing that the EAC, to bring it back to your question, has been doing is come up with voluntary guidelines for determining what sort of machines are good to use. You mentioned Louisiana using purely electronic voting machines. They're, I think, maybe the only place in the country still doing that. That's a
There was
real
a couple
problem.
of counties in Indiana last I checked, but that's it. Yeah.
It's a real problem when we have a lot of distrust of elections and election results because the only way you do a recount on that machine is you push a button again and it gives you the same number. So you need a physical piece of paper. So how are people voting today? They're voting either with optical scan typically, or now we've got these new machines, touch screen, but they print a ballot, and those machines are controversial themselves because they also print a QR code. And the question is the QR code the record of the vote or how people vote? So these are the kinds of questions that the EAC could be helpful with. Now, when the EAC was formed, it really had no power other than doling out money and advising it. And like some small things like, what we thought was a small thing, determining what goes on the federal postcard form for voter registration. So
Oh, sure.
federal law, goes back to a 1993 law, says however a state does voter registration, anybody who wants to vote in federal elections should be able to use this postcard. The EAC was just sued by Louisiana because Louisiana is saying, your postcard doesn't ask for documentary proof of citizenship. We want to have that. So that lawsuit just started, and that's ongoing. In the meantime, the EAC, two Democrats, two Republicans typically, it has stalemated a lot. It has not really been a leader. When I speak to audiences and I say, how many of you have heard of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission? It's a self-selected audience. Almost no one has. And yet the National Association of Secretaries of State has for years, both Democrats and Republicans condemned the EAC and said, we should get rid of this agency. It's too much federal power. So there's been, ever since HAVA, ever since the Help America Vote Act, a question of how much power to the federal government, how much power to the states. I mean, the current environment with Trump calling for nationalizing elections certainly brings this issue to the fore, but it's not as though he invented the question of federal versus state power for elections. As I understand it now, the EAC has stalled in coming up with the second round of a second generation of voter guidelines. And that's really important because these voting machines that were adopted after the 2000 election, they're reaching the end of their lives, and we've got to figure out what's going to come next. And so, unfortunately, the EAC, like many other agencies that have Democrats, Republicans, have divided on party lines on all kinds of issues that you might expect.
Right. It's exactly like the Federal Election Commission, which has nothing to do with election administration, despite its name, is much more campaign finance oriented, but in the same way that they are often just split right down the middle and may get nothing done, as is the EAC.
Well, it's even worse at the Federal Election Commission now because they only have two commissioners. They don't have a quorum, so they can't do anything.
That's absolutely not true, Rick. There are four commissioners.
No, for the FEC.
On the FEC.
Oh, I'm sorry, FEC. I heard EAC, and I'm like,
well, Paul, I want to talk to you about the EAC. So, what is your lasting experience with the EAC?
Well, so I want to take a point of nerd privilege and tell you what Rick didn't tell you about that fabulous ballot with 100 and how many candidates on it in California?
135.
The state of California requires you to rotate the candidates so no candidate has the position of being the first on the ballot for every voter. And so literally 135 ballots in a pad, candidate one goes to the bottom and bubbles his way back up as you go handing out ballots to people. So it adds a whole layer of election administration nightmare that most of us hope never come to our state, but God bless California for that. So I have been serving. It's funny, Rick, you had mentioned the voluntary voting system guidelines because although she didn't mention it in my bio, in addition to serving on the EAC Standards Board, I am also I represent the EAC Standards Board to the Technical Guideline Development Committee that helps develop the voluntary voting system guidelines, and I've been doing that for a number of years now. And right now, the part of our problem is the TGDC is missing about 40% of its membership, and we just found out last week at the EAC Standards Board meeting that they had denied the appointments for one of the Standards Board members, for the people who were there to represent the disability community, for the person from IEEE. All of those people were that we had been waiting on approval of their appointments, were all dumped from the system and disapproved. And so now we literally have barely an operational majority. If one member doesn't show up for a meeting, we can't even discuss business, which kind of hampers what needs to be done. But certainly VVSG 2.0 is real. And has been around. We finalized VVSG 2.0 in 2020 when no one else was doing anything.
And this would be the first meaningful. Just to put this in context for the audience, right? Like this would be the first meaningful time that the minimum standards for voting machines have been updated since they were initially passed in what was the VVSG 1.1, 2005, 2000.
Yeah.
So we're talking about 20 years.
6, yeah.
That it's
And
been. Mhm.
and it made quite a lot of changes, but unfortunately, research and development, voting system people don't, don't turn on that dime, and nobody wants to be the first one in. And so we have only just seen the certification of two vendors to the VVSG 2.0 standard. Now, those of us on the ground running elections in 2020 and in 2024, we heard a lot of complaints from voters who did not understand why we were not using VVSG 2.0 certified equipment, and the answer at that time was because we don't have any to buy. Even if we wanted to do it,
It just doesn't.
it just doesn't exist yet. And so that piece is moving certainly slower than I imagine the executive branch would like. And we are all trying to do the best we can with the goal in mind of making sure we're serving the voters best. Um,
So
and
we're
so
So I guess where we find ourselves, right, is that we have this law. It passes in 2002. It does all these wonderful things, or so it says, and then it creates this agency to carry out many of those things. But we've not afforded any funding. That agency is not particularly effective. And so here we find ourselves today, right? And so I'm wondering if we can sort of like fast forward just a little bit to the sort of enduring mythology and misinformation that have come out of the 2000 election. And I think the most obvious one is that I think, and Rick, you should tell me if I'm wrong, that this was really the first time that a major political party was asserting fraud on a scale of that size with no real evidence that there was fraud, right? So, for example, everybody remembers the Brooks Brothers riot, all of those be-khakkied men running into a building and saying, stop the fraud, stop the fraud. But what was actually happening there was just a recount, right? It was not fraud at all. And so is that something that we're left with, that this everything is fraud and so nothing is fraud? Or what else sticks out for you?
Sure. Well, I'd say yes and no. No, claims of fraud did not start with the 2000 election. In fact, for this book that I'm researching, describing democracy from 1964 to 2024, I talk about how in the 1960s we still had stolen elections. And there's a good chance that um, John F. Kennedy became president rather than Nixon because of fraud in both Illinois and in Texas. But there was no way to get around the Daley machine and the Johnson machine, and so that was the end of that. And one of the mysteries I'm trying to untangle in my book is how did we get away from fraudulent elections? But at that time, Republicans were yelling fraud, and they were yelling fraud because there was fraud, and they continued to yell fraud even as election uh, uh, machinery got better, even as elections got better, even as stolen elections were not really a thing anymore. I'm looking at the archives of the Alabama Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. They're organizing ballot security measures to go and look for fraud, and they're having trouble finding volunteers. So all of that predates um, Bush versus Gore. But what Bush versus Gore did is it moved the issue of elections into the public consciousness, and it moved the nuts and bolts about how elections are run into the public consciousness. So we have what I call the period of the voting wars that starts after 2000, which is where the typical Republican frame is that our elections are rife with fraud, or at least the potential for fraud. The typical Democratic frame is that measures that Republicans are taking to prevent fraud are actually meant to suppress the vote. And so you start seeing I mentioned more litigation. You start seeing more legislation passing when you've got the same party that controls the governorship and the two houses of the state legislature. To get more partisan election administration, you get courts involved, and the courts start dividing along ideological lines, and the fraud claims just get bigger and bigger until we get to Trump, where it's kind of like the main thing he talks about. He talks about it so often that it can't help but influence how people think about elections. And even if they don't believe what he's saying, I think it sows a kind of distrust generally in how our elections are run. So claims of stolen elections, not new. Claims of fraud, not new. And suppression, not new. But they kind of took on a special resonance once people realized that in very close elections, the rules of the game matter, and people are paying much more attention to the rules and the technology and all the ways that in close elections, you might be able to turn your loss into a victory. The key point about 2000 is that the margin of error in that election exceeded the margin of victory for any candidate. There's no way to know who really won Florida, although under most of the legal test, it would have been Bush. But what we learned is in really close elections, all bets are off. And so we have to, go with the election administrator's prayer, Lord, let this election not be close. And that way you don't have to determine those really difficult questions.
Yeah, high turnout, wide margins, etc. Paul, I wonder how that affected you on the ground, right? Like, you've been there in your office in some capacity since 1999. Have you seen the suspicion grow over time? Has it ebbed and flowed? What are you left with?
Well, and ironically, one of the first questions, of course, a lot of people asked me after 2000, and I was still just the IT guy for several years after that, before I started moving up the ladder. But a lot of people asked me, Paul, when is all this stuff? When is it all going to be over? When's it all going to be over? And I said, maybe 2006, maybe 2008. And they were like, what? 2006, 2008. I said, oh, yeah, because the 2002 election is going to have to be flawless. The 2004 election with increased scrutiny is going to have to be even more flawless before maybe people stop being suspicious of how elections are being conducted again. And then, of course, other things happened in 2002. We had the slow starting touchscreen only machines with no paper ballot. Janet Reno, who was on the ballot, couldn't vote because her polling place wasn't open. We had poll extensions. We had all these other things that started happening in 2002. And in my head, I'm going, okay, that just kicked us again to 2008 and just keep kind of kicking it down the road. And when it comes to lawsuits, like Rick said, I mean, there's been a lot of suspicion around it, but not so many lawsuits. I think I'm currently involved in 6 or 7 federal lawsuits. To be honest, I'm starting to lose track because my lawyer emails me and says, "Here's a new thing going in this lawsuit," and I'm like, "Wait a minute, which one is this again?" Because we're still getting sued over things that happened, and like most states. The lawmakers make laws, the governor signs laws, and then those of us who have to implement the laws are the ones that get sued, even though we may not have even implemented it yet. Florida just passed Senate Bill or House Bill 991, and we already have lawsuits for that, and the effective date for the most egregious parts that the plaintiffs don't like aren't even in effect until January of 2027, and we're already in court about it. I haven't implemented any of it. How can you say I'm violating anyone's constitutional right at this stage when I haven't done anything yet? But so the lawsuits are a very real thing, and a lot of us too. Our 2020 was really a litmus test for a lot of it, and when I look at the suspicion, it always astounds me because going through the national organizations like the Election Center, whatever we call IACRI now, you know, getting to know people who do what I do from other states where we call things different things, where our procedures are not necessarily the same as they are in Florida, but our goal is ultimately the same. It's interesting to find out that, you had while the Democrats in Florida were saying the evil touchscreen voting machines have to be gotten rid of because, the Republicans are rigging the elections. Up in Maryland, the Republicans were saying the evil touchscreen voting machines have to be gotten rid of because that's how the Democrats are rigging elections. And I'm like, you can't both be right. It doesn't work that way. So either it is or it isn't. And so most of the time, when you start looking, it's almost 100% partisan bias. And Rick, I thank you for mentioning, because a lot of people are really down when we talk about the 2000 election on Katherine Harris, because as the Secretary of State, as the chief election official for Florida, she was the chair of the George Bush campaign for president. But they forget that our Attorney General, Bob Butterworth, who was issuing opinions about the election, was the chair of the Al Gore campaign for the state of Florida. And so that doesn't help the suspicion of people presuming that there's partisan bias. And if you're doing what this person says, then you must be on their side. Actually, what I have is a law book, and I do what the law book tells me to do. That's what I do. And if you don't like the laws, call the lawmakers in Tallahassee to change the laws, because I have to do what's in the book. That's all of most of my counterparts regardless of what county they're from here in Florida. Most of them, I couldn't tell you whether they're Republican or Democrat, because when we get together, we don't talk politics. We get together and we talk about how do we serve voters better, and how do we make the process better.
So I want to make sure that we have a couple of minutes for a couple of the questions that have come in, and one of them is a comment which I want to read. This is from Kim Brace. She says, "I was Al Gore's expert witness who testified."
That's a he.
What?
He.
Oh, it's a he. I'm sorry. It is Kim Brace. I know who you are. Kimball. Sorry.
Yes.
Kim Brace. I was Al Gore's expert witness who testified on that Saturday morning to demonstrate the chads in the machine. I opened the machine over the judge's desk and the chads flew out. See, I said. Kim Brace. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate you. All right. And then we have another question here. What do you think journalists and media outlets did well, and I'm going to add not well, during the 2000 presidential election and helping the public understand what was happening and what came next, and how has that changed, and for better or worse? Who wants to start? Maybe I'll go to Rick first.
Well, so first thing I'll say is you need to take yourself back to, we had the internet.
Yeah.
It took like 45 minutes after Bush versus Gore was issued before I was able to find the opinion on the Washington Post website. And it took like 5 minutes to download. So I just want to, there's no social media, So, I mean, I think that if Bush versus Gore happened now, it would be much worse and we're much more polarized now. I think journalists, for the most part, did a really good job. The thing is, like, they would call me and ask me questions about some Florida statute. It's like, I never read that Florida statute. In my election law casebook, we're now in the 7th edition of the casebook, until Bush versus Gore, we didn't have a section on election administration. We were dealing with redistricting and campaign finance and initiatives. This was something we left for the public policy people. It was not the kind of thing. So there weren't really that many experts. There were lawyers who did recounts and they understood how bad the machines were. But there was so everyone was flying blind. And in addition to that, some of the legal theories that were offered in the case were legal theories that were novel legal theories. And the worst thing to do is to have to decide a question that's never been decided before, if you're a court, in the context of a presidential election where it's outcome determinative. So you ended up with the most conservative members of the court embracing the most liberal theory possible about equal protection, and the most liberal members of the court rejecting that idea. So, and I'm not impugning the motives of anybody, but there's a lot of, subconscious bias, motivated reasoning. And because the election was so close, you could point to almost anything. You could say, it's because Ralph Nader ran on this ticket. It's because this one county in Florida accepted military ballots that came in by fax. You could point to almost anything if you could make up a 500 ballot difference. And so I think journalists did as well as they could under the circumstances. I think today journalists are much better trained. I mean, it's not just that there are people on the democracy beat who study this. It's also that I think election administrators are much more professionalized and they're much more savvy at talking to the media about what's going on. And I actually think, and I'll just make this the last thing I say about this, is that the most important thing that can be done to restore or keep trust in elections in 2026 and beyond is provide pathways for local election administrators to explain what's going on and be transparent. Because when you actually explain it, then a lot of those conspiracy theories, just disappear.
Paul, what was your experience of the media in 2000 when you were kicking around?
So of course, our biggest problem with the media in 2000 was the fact that the exit pollers called the state for Al Gore and said all the polls were closed when all the polls weren't closed. So one of the first lessons the media had to learn was that look at the time zone map and make sure that you're reporting things accurately, because that put a bit of a bitter taste in our mouth. But I will say that they were and they were hyper focused on Palm Beach, and that became sort of the center point for all things wrong with elections. Everything poor Palm Beach just couldn't catch a break for years later. Everything was Palm Beach's fault. I can tell you that as a result of our changes in Florida, as a result of HAVA and the way we changed our recount procedures in Florida. When I was president of our state association in 2018, we had a triple statewide recount: U.S. Senator, Governor, and Secretary of Agriculture, all three of them being recounted with paper ballots across all 67 counties. And the only odd one out, again, God bless Palm Beach County, they were using older versions of equipment and they could not outstack while they were rescanning the ballots multiple races for a recount. The rest of us could, they could not, they did not, they just simply ran out of time. They did not have time to rescan all the ballots. But again, it didn't stop people from being in mobs out in front of it, chanting, that they're trying to steal the election. We found this. Where did this mysterious box of ballots come from? Things that we heard, innumerable times in 2020 about mysterious boxes of ballots showing up. But in Bush v. Gore, we had less than 6 million votes to be recounted in Florida, and how all that worked out. Rick did an excellent job explaining it. I won't rehash it. But fast forward to 2018, we had 7.3 million ballots, not including the 933,000 from Palm Beach County that did not get done. And everything went so smooth that everyone was like, gosh, 2000, this would have been great if 2000 was like this. And the media were very positive with most things. There was some controversy down in Broward County where they found ballots that had not been tabulated that got added to the totals. The most heartwarming story I have about the 2018 recount was in Miami-Dade, where because of the way their ballot is, and because they have to do the ballot in both English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, one voter gets 4 or 5 ballot cards, 17 inches long, double-sided. That's one ballot. And the races that were being recounted were all on the first card of that 5-card stack. And once they're in the box, and once they've been through the machine, there's they don't sort themselves magically. And so they had to hand sort before they could even begin their recount over 4 million pieces of paper to find the 813,000 ballots that had been cast in Miami in that election. And when they came up short, she called me, the supervisor at the time called me in a panic and said, Paul, what am I going to do? I can't find 12 ballots. I said, give me a break. You have looked through 4 million pieces of paper and you can't find 12. And she sent her staff back and they found the 12 before they had to start the recount to make sure that everything got counted. So the media has been much more careful about issuing, they don't listen to exit pollers anymore for the most part. Very seldom do we hear about exit pollers coming around. And the media has been much more, it's all about relationships and building the relationships with your local media more so than the national media, because I usually never get to see or talk to those people. But in 2018, I was on Fox News, I was on CNN, I was on NPR, I was on just about every news outlet to talk about the 2018 recount. And all of them were very respectful. All of them were very open-minded. All of them wanted to hear about the policies and the procedures and the transparency and what we were all doing to make sure that everybody was comfortable with when we got to the end, that we all trusted the results. And that goes a long way, building those relationships, particularly with your local media. But it's just as important that the national media, sometimes I cringe when I'm watching the news. I don't care which news channel I'm watching. I spend a lot of time cringing going, gosh, if they would just pick up the phone and call me, I could answer that. Rick, you probably do the same thing. Pick up the phone and call me. We could answer that question in 2 seconds, and then you'd be putting out the right information. But we don't live in a perfect world yet.
All right, we are 1 minute away from being done, but I want to leave everybody on a positive note. One of the modal questions we received as these came in was not about the 2000 election at all, but about the one coming up. And the question was, is it going to happen? And I think that I know both of your answers, but why don't we just go ahead and make you say it individually? Rick, are the midterms going to happen?
The midterms are going to happen. I do think that there are reasons to be concerned that there could be interference or problems, but we have enough time that there are things that we can do. But there's no authority to stop an election. One of the strengths of having a decentralized system is there's no button that someone could push to turn elections off. So I'm very confident we're going to hold elections, and I'm very optimistic that they will be free and fair.
What about you, Paul?
Well, I'm 110% optimistic that they will be free and fair, because I know my counterparts. And I'll end on this anecdote because a lot of people ask me at the local coffee shop, Paul, we trust you, we like you, we know you run good elections here in Okaloosa County. And I told them, I said, don't you think my counterparts in the other counties in Florida, in other parts of the country, aren't sitting in their local coffee shops being told the exact same thing by their people? All elections are local, and the local trust. We've just got to be able to push that out on a national scale. Absolutely, the midterms are going to happen, and
Great.
absolutely they'll be free and fair.
And if you're worried about it, call your clerk. That would be my big
Call
advice.
whoever runs elections in your county. They'll be happy to
Absolutely.
bury you in details.
And probably show you an old voting machine if you want to see one. All right. On that note, thank you both. This is really fun, at least for me. I hope it was fun for the audience. But I told you to bring this and you did. There it is. Look at all of this swag we brought. It's like show and tell for Votebeat. Thank you everyone for being here. I so appreciate your time. Please subscribe to our newsletters and visit us again. We're at votebeat.org. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Rick.